Welcome, everyone. I'm Barbara Slavin. I direct the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council, and we are about to have what I hope will be a really interesting and in-depth discussion about Iran's presidential elections. I hope you can hear me. It's hard to find much to celebrate about last week's elections for those of us who support better relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran. As you all know, credible opposition candidates were disqualified by the Guardian Council, and the turnout, even according to official figures, was the lowest in the history of the Islamic Republic. Only about 48%, and really only 72% if you count the spoiled ballots, which came in second to the winner, Ibrahim Raisi. His vote count was about 17 million, the same number he got when he lost in 2017 to Hassan Rouhani. So Raisi has not grown his base. He was elected by less than a quarter of Iran's eligible voters, and that doesn't seem like much of a mandate. His background, as you all know, he's an apparatchik from the eastern shrine city of Mashhad, perhaps not coincidentally the hometown of the supreme leader. He has a grim record as one of 4 prosecutors who signed off on the execution of thousands of political prisoners in 1988. And his record as head of the judiciary in Iran for the past couple of years is also pretty poor. As far as I can see, he's not visited the West, and he is extremely inexperienced in both foreign policy and economic policy. So what are we to make of the outlook for his presidency? First and foremost for Iranians, and then for the rest of the world. A return to the 2015 nuclear deal looks likely, but perhaps not much after. What are the chances for improved ties with the neighbors, with Europe and the United States? And how will Iranians express their discontent given the apparent collapse of the old reformist movement? So we have a great group of experts. We're going to start with Professor Sadegh Zibakalam, a professor at the University of Tehran, who is joining us from Tehran. Then we're going to go to Azadeh Zami-Mirad, who's an Iran researcher and deputy head of the African Middle East Division for the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. She'll be followed by Fatima Hagigashvili, a former reformist member of the Iranian parliament, who now directs the Nonviolent Initiative for Democracy. And finally, veteran foreign correspondent and our very own non-resident fellow, Borzu Dargahi. A reminder to everyone that you can submit your questions to the panel in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. And please do tweet at the hashtag #ACMidEast. I believe this is being live streamed on Twitter as well. So Professor Zibakalam, I know we only have you for an hour, and I really want to go to you first and have you tell us what the mood is in Tehran 2 days after the election.
Do you have my voice?
We have your voice, yes. We have your voice, yes.
You have my voice.
Yes, and your face.
Oh.
So please go ahead. What is the mood in Tehran? Nice to see you again.
Allah be praised for the success of having my voice and my face. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I must say that unlike last week, when their mood was very subdued and everyone was depressed, it appears that, believe it or not, that the outcome of the election has turned many opponents of the regime, it has turned them very happy, because they appear to have managed to say that we are staying away of the vote. We do not like you. We do not want you, and we are going to show it by staying away from the polling station. And that's exactly what they did 3 days ago on Friday. Barbara, I believe that even the regime, even the authorities, the Islamic authorities, even they could not believe that there would be such a huge boycott of the election. Official figures says that 30 million people did not take part in the election. Well, that in itself means more than 50% of the eligible electorate did not vote. And of course, in some cities such as Tehran, Isfahan, Mashhad, Rasht, principal cities, the absentees, the people who boycotted the election, the figures is even much higher than 48%, which is for the entire country. Another point is that the election on Friday was coincide with the election on Friday was coincide, in fact, with the municipal election, and many people actually take part, not realizing that it is possible that their name would be taken for taking part in the presidential election as well. And other factors into consideration, we could say very with accuracy, reasonable accuracy, that only around 30% of the population actually took part in the election. What was more disastrous was actually the 1 hour international press interview, which Mr. Raisi conducted about 4 or 5 hours ago. And again, it didn't help in any way to present a better picture of Mr. Raisi. It was obvious that Mr. Raisi, the people would ask you about the human rights violation, about the execution of 1988. It was obvious that people would ask you about the negotiation. It was obvious that the correspondent and journalists would ask you about present the negotiation in Vienna, and it appears that he only responded. His reply was as though I mean, if he was Chief Justice, he would have said the same thing. If he was not elected as a president, he would have said the same thing. If it were Rouhani, we would have heard the same reply. And it was really, really terrible. He could have helped to some extent. He could have helped to present a better picture of himself, of the election. He could have said that I know people are dissatisfied. I know people are unhappy. I know that there are many problems. I'm trying to solve them. I'm hoping that my presidency would, after 4 years, will bring more people to take part in the election. I sympathize with many Iranians who didn't take part in the election. Nothing. He just blamed the pandemic for people not taking part in the election. And the second reason for people not taking part in the election was that they were disappointed because of the poor performance of Rouhani during the past 8 years. People were disappointed, therefore they didn't take part in the election. The entire 1 hour interview did not help at all to present a better picture of himself and of hardliners and of the election.
Well, I guess I should congratulate you then that the boycott was so successful. But I'm very curious where you go from here. So think about that for a second. I'm going to go next to Azadeh, who has been following the trend lines, and we'll have a little bit of discussion of that, and then we'll come back to you, Professor. So Azadeh.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for organizing this event. Yes, I'll be happy to share some of my observations on the elections. I think it's clear that we have already entered now a transition stage of managing succession. And that's a critical stage. I mean, managing succession is a critical stage for all autocratic systems. And it appears at this point, at least, that Raisi is in a best position, or certainly in a most advantageous one, to become the next supreme leader. However, I think it's not so clear whether things will actually go that smoothly. And I think we shouldn't, presume that this kind of the degree of engineering that took place this time around will actually pay off in a succession question. There are a number of challenges that still remain. I mean, for one, the conservative spectrum is not a united front. It actually never has been. We still have different groups, families, and camps competing for a certain degree of power. We have a new generation of self-proclaimed revolutionaries who have a quite critical stance when it comes to the current establishment. So Raisi would still have to garner kind of a broader backing here. Same goes with the position of the supreme leader. I mean, there are other potential competitors still in the race, including the son of the current supreme leader. At least there's wide speculation going on this front. So him becoming the next supreme leader is not a given. And add to that the presidency actually in Iran has never really been a position that was particularly beneficial for your political career. I mean, since 1989, not a single president has actually come out of the presidency unharmed. They have usually been marginalized or ostracized. So a lot will depend on how long Raisi will have to remain on this position and how he will actually perform. And given that he doesn't really have much experience in politics, given his 4 decades backgrounds in the judiciary, I think it's going to be a very difficult political sphere for him to navigate, particularly on the arguably most difficult, most challenging position you could hold in the political order of the Islamic Republic, certainly one that is most exposed to broad criticism. So a lot of uncertainties, I think, on that front. The other thing that has changed significantly, and I think is going to be quite important, is the change in the electorate. And I think we've already heard some indication here. We have seen a historically low turnout. And I do not believe that the main reason for that is actually the degree to which the pre-selection was engineered this time around. I actually believe that even if more reformist or more influential reformist figures were allowed to run, we probably most likely would have seen an outcome more similar to the one that we've seen here now. And the outcome is, in effect, actually kind of the logical conclusion of more than 4 decades of general unresponsiveness of the state to popular demands here, and particularly in the past 4 years where yet another moderate government was not able to deliver. So I think what we see in the electorate is a lot of apathy, we see a lot of resignation, we see a lot of anger and frustration, but at the same time, I see a lot of passion. I actually see a certain degree of decisiveness. We have a number of Iranians who did not vote as a deliberate act of resistance, as kind of one of the few avenues that they have to send a clear message to the state. And in that regard, I would say they've been actually successful, because everybody today is talking about the low turnout. Everybody is talking about it being an historic low. All kind of circles of the establishment are talking about it. This is not something that can be ignored at this point. What I think is important in that regard is not to mistake, though, or to misconstrue this low turnout as lower kind of drive to work towards political change. I think rather what we're seeing at this point is people realizing, or part of the Iranian population realizing, that the desired change cannot be achieved through traditional means of reformists. And here I think this is a very bitter pill actually to swallow for the reformist current, that as a faction in its current state, it has been rejected essentially by both the state and society. So I do not see this as a sustainable stage. It has to change. They have to adapt moving forward. So all in all, I feel that the current situation is much more dynamic than meets the eye. There's a lot more uncertainty on whether engineered elections will actually pay off in the long run when it comes to succession. I think there's continued social demand for change, and there will be other new avenues for people to demand that change. And I think while things might go smoothly here, we might actually see more and heightened infighting and see a more heated socio-political environment altogether.
Thank you. That was great. I actually want to go back to Professor Ziba Kalam, if I could, just to get your reaction to what Azadeh said and to the question that I posed earlier, that change cannot be achieved through the traditional means of the ballot box. We've certainly seen that. So having had this success in terms of boycott, what do you expect? Do you think there's going to be more sort of Gandhi-esque civil disobedience? How will people communicate? We hear that Clubhouse will probably be somehow filtered out for many Iranians after serving its purpose for the election. Briefly, if you can, and then we'll go to Fatima.
Yeah, Barbara, it was not only the establishment that took a powerful no from the people. The reformists did even more badly than the government. No one heeded the call of Mr. Khatami, the charismatic leader of the reformists. And 2.5 million people voted for Mr. Hemmati, who was the official and announced candidate for the reformists. I believe that this election would be a landmark. People who would come in years' time and would study, investigate, and write about Iranian modern history after the Islamic Revolution would definitely look upon this election, the June 2021 election, as a landmark of the history of the Islamic Republic, because it's not only the government that took the message that the people are no longer with you. The reformists took also that message that people have gone beyond you. People no longer, Mr. Khatami, reformists, people no longer look upon you as the leader, as a credible opposition. Now, what will happen from now on? I don't know. I really don't know. But the important thing is that both the government and reformist movement, they must seriously think about the future of Iran and themselves.
Okay, thank you. Now let me go to Fatima. I believe you also have some slides that you want to show. So I hope that our technological wizards who are behind the camera can help you share your screen. And I also see that people are beginning to put questions in the Q&A box, which is great, and we will get to them very, very soon. So keep on doing that. Fatima, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I would like to share. Do you see my?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So I think, as my colleague in this panel explained, this shows, this drawing shows what the election look like. It gives a visual. I would like to show another slide that shows turnout for different. We had 13 election. And shows like different turnout, which actually this would help to understand a bit more about how look like the current turnout is. So in this election, 51% of voters did not vote. The question is why? Is it because of the election boycott, or other key factor contributed in? And how can we weight the impact of election boycott campaign from general apathy? In this election, two groups claim victory. The supreme leader called this election as an epic turnout, while the turnout rate was about 49%, the lowest presidential election since 1979. On the other hand, those regime change activists who called for a boycott claim victory. I would like to explain the later claim as the regime's claim clear is empty. I believe there are several contributing factors to interpret this low turnout. Definitely one portion of that is related to the effort of regime change boycott campaigner, and I believe their voice is stronger now. But I assume there are several key factors that play greater roles in low turnout, such as in countries opposition, no vote position. As you see, I separate in country opposition vote with outsider, uncompetitive election, the impact of sanction on living condition of the people, COVID-19. Unfortunately, there hasn't been any survey to understand the weight of each contributing factor. I would like to give a higher weight to competitiveness factor, because I assume if the election was bipolar, we would have witnessed a higher turnout. Despite the regime change boycotters' effort in the previous competitive election, the turnout was 80%, 85%, 72%, and 73%. Once the election is not competitive, the turnout rate drops, as seen in Hashemi Rafsanjani's second term with 51% turnout. For this exact reason, the Supreme Leader and his allies barred all potential winning candidates to pave the way for Raisi, because they knew the turnout would be low, predicted by the survey trend. As the former intelligence minister Haydar Moslehi disclosed recently that in 2013 presidential election, intelligence indicated that Mr. Hashemi would win. Moslehi asked the Guardian Council to bar him, so it duly did. That is why I call this election as an electoral coup d'etat, like many other activists. The second, living conditions have deteriorated dramatically for multiple reasons, including corruption and mismanagement and crippling sanction. Third, undelivered presidential campaign election promises. Fourth, the restricted social and political atmosphere with heavy scrutinized political environment. Five, no vote position of in the country opposition leaders such as Mir Hossein Mousavi, Taizadeh, some political party. So I wouldn't conclude that 51% of people haven't cast their vote purely due to the boycott campaign. I would interpret that people are deeply unhappy, they want change. This can be a change in the structure of the regime or improving living conditions regardless of who rules them. I believe if, let's say, next election, I doubt that it would be competitive, because why they have competitive election if they can win it? So if become a competitive election, I believe the turnout will go up. My point here is, with one event, one election, really we cannot interpret everything. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to go to Borzu next, but I want to bring in some of the questions that are coming in. This one comes from Mehdi Askaria, who says, please do not dismiss the role that Donald Trump played in the recent elections. So, Borzu, how much did the US withdrawal from the JCPOA, the maximum pressure campaign, and so on, impact all of this? And should we blame, how much of the blame does Donald Trump get for this outcome, or was it likely anyway?
I think it was probably likely anyway, with Khamenei getting up there. But absolutely, the Trump administration's policies completely and totally discredited the moderate faction, completely and totally obliterated any base they had in society, made a mockery of Rouhani's promises of improving the economy and so on. So I think it did have an impact. But just going broader, I think that the fact that it failed, the fact that maximum pressure failed, had the bigger impact. I mean, if you think about it, look at it from the Beit Rahbari, think of it from the point of view of the Supreme Leader's office. These guys are saying, my God, what a few years we've had. We had maximum pressure. We had nationwide protests. We had the coronavirus pandemic. We had our economy going down. We had record low oil prices. We had the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. We had, regular airstrikes by Israel on our assets in Syria and Iraq. And well, look around us now. Trump is gone. Netanyahu is gone. And we're here and we're stronger than ever. So I think that there is, in this election, I think, and I've written this in my stories, there is an arrogance by the leadership in Iran. There is a sort of blithe disregard for the trappings of democracy. I think that is an important thing that has happened in Iran. And I think that is in tune with the mood of the world in general. I think they made a calculation. Who cares about democratic legitimacy in the era of Lukashenko and the Republican Party steamrolling over democratic niceties in the United States, in the era where elections are basically forged and you can control people using their phones. They put little, the dog chain that everyone has on them now. You can monitor them and so on. We don't really need democratic legitimacy anymore. It's overrated. And you have the Christian Science Monitor had a great piece in which they actually quoted someone inside the regime saying essentially that, saying, this whole democracy thing, look at Oman, they're not doing so poorly, and they don't have any elections. They don't have people whining and complaining about stuff because they don't have elections. Maybe we don't need the democratic niceties. And I think that is regionally, I think that is setting the stage for potentially, a very confident, regionally victorious in many respects. Iran is potentially a more regionally ambitious one. Look, if they look at the wreckage of the last few years, they're still in Syria. They still have those assets in Syria. Their militias in Iraq are in many ways stronger than ever. The bonds with the Houthis are stronger than ever. There's trouble brewing in Afghanistan. They have ties to both the government of Ashraf Ghani and they have ties to the Taliban. And so they're well prepared for any possibilities there. They've got, chips on a lot of different numbers on the roulette table. So I think that there's a possibility of an overconfident Iran seeking a more ambitious regional role because of the failure of maximum pressure.
Interesting. I want to go back to Professor Ziba Kalam and ask you the Trump question, how much that mattered. But there's also a question specifically for you from Mahmoud Monshipuri. He asks, conservatives now control all the levers of power, parliament, court, presidency. Does that help policy making, especially foreign policy making? Will it make it easier when it comes to dealing with the West and with the US?
Barbara, let me answer the question that you just raised from one of the audience. There are some reformists who say that maybe it wasn't such a terrible thing, that election. Maybe the fact that Raisi became president is a blessing in disguise. Why? Because all the branches of the power is now at the hand of the hardliners. They control Iranian Majlis, Iranian parliament. They control the executive branch of the government. And they have the judiciary. They have the Revolutionary Guard. They have the intelligence section of the Revolutionary Guard. They have the armed forces. They have the money. They have everything. So if things are going bad for Iranian people, then they must answer. They must be. They must explain why things are going bad. So far, the important decision, the strategical decision, what we do in Iraq, what we do in Syria, what we do in Lebanon, what we do in Yemen, as far as the nuclear program is concerned, as far as developing more advanced missile, etc., all these decisions were taken by the hardliner. But the bill was sent to Mr. Rouhani, because all these decisions, all these strategies that were adopted by the hardliner, they had a heavy price. They brought heavy price for Iranian economy to pay for them. The fact that we are engaged in Yemen, for example, requires a lot of expenditure. The fact that Iran is spending so much for the nuclear program, they spend so much, and the government cuts from the education, the government cuts from the corona, etc. And when things got bad, the hardliner pointed the finger at Rouhani, that Mr. Rouhani, what's happening? Why the economy in such a horrible state? Why you haven't done anything as far as the vaccination against the corona was concerned? You haven't done anything. Iraq, there are 20% of the population have been vaccinated. In Afghanistan, 30% of the population have been vaccinated. In Iran, it's less than 10%. Mr. Rouhani, what are you doing? That scenario would finish from next month, because all the three branches of the government now is at the hand of the hardliner. And they can no longer blame Rouhani, blame reformists, blame Sadiq Ziba Kalam, blame this, blame that, for the poor state that Iran is in. That's why some reformists call this election a blessing in disguise, which forces the hardliner to be answerable for the decisions and for the policies.
Okay, Azadeh, let me come back to you about the position of this incoming government toward the United States and toward the nuclear talks. We've already heard from Ibrahim Raisi that he's not going to meet Joe Biden. Well, Hassan Rouhani didn't meet Joe Biden either, and he certainly didn't meet Donald Trump. So there's no surprise there. But of course, the Biden administration has talked about a so-called longer and stronger nuclear agreement, and that, I mean, it seems we'll be lucky to get the JCPOA back. How stable is this nuclear agreement? What are the threats that you see to it?
Well, I think it's in fact really unlikely that Raisi would come and toss out the nuclear agreement out of the window altogether. I think nobody expecting that. He doesn't have the power to do that autonomously anyways, and there seems to be a systemic consensus when it comes to the agreement. Where we might see some differences in the future, however, is with regard, I think, to implementation. Bear in mind that Raisi now, as a president, will not back the nuclear agreement the way that Rouhani has been backing it. In fact, for Rouhani, the nuclear agreement was a cornerstone of his policies. It was one of his main political projects. So he invested a lot of political capital in upholding it. We will not see that kind of capital flowing into the agreement under Raisi. And this might cause some problems when it comes to disagreements on implementation. We might see reduced cooperation with the International Atomic Agency organization. And there are also already challenges on the horizon. I mean, there are outstanding questions on uranium particles on 3 undisclosed sites, where the IAEA expects Iran to clarify these questions. So this will be a bit of a test to see how the Raisi government will deal with these issues. But if I may also, turn to some of the questions or remarks that I've heard so far with regard to all the branches of power being in hardline hands. And I agree. I think there's a certain degree of hope that this will weaken their position. As I said, usually when it comes to conservatives, I mean, infighting is always a part of it. The last time we had three branches of power in the hand of one hardline faction was under Ahmadinejad. That was when the Islamic Republic was actually at the brink of collapse or at its most vulnerable. Now, obviously, there are a lot of differences between Ahmadinejad, who regards himself an anti-establishment figure, and Raisi, who is basically the epitome of an establishment figure. But still, that just goes to show that just because you have all powers, all branches of power in your hand, doesn't mean that everything is going to be easier for you when it comes to implementation. And lastly, on Trump, I think it's an important point to make in Maximum Pressure. Just very concretely, if you look at the first term of Rouhani, in fact, he was trying to push back on some of the unaccountable power centers in Iran's economy, namely religious foundations or the enterprises of the Revolutionary Guards. Once you're under massive sanctions pressure, it's really difficult to push back on irregular trade channels because you essentially depend on them to conduct your business under this type of pressure. So some of the progress that we saw actually Rouhani make on the economic front when it came to pushing back certain entities, including the IRGC enterprises, basically came to a halt. The kind of pushes for transparency, for more accountability, for less involvement in the economy, they came to a halt. So these have actually weakened kind of the executive in the position. Still, and I think it's an important point to make, in the end, economic, political, social problems in Iran are not the result of US policy and not the result of Trump's policy. I think maximum pressure policy has made some things worse, and they have certainly, I would say, affected the socio-political environment in which different political factions compete for power. That much, I think, can definitely be said, but they're not the source of the kind of problems and deep-going woes that we see across the board in the Islamic Republic.
All right, thanks. I have two very important questions, actually. I'm going to go to you, Fatima, with these. One is about the status of minority groups in Iran, ethnic minorities like the Kurds, religious minorities like the Baha'is, the Sunnis. What will Raisi's election mean, if anything, for these groups which have been repressed? And then there's another one that's really fascinating, and I'll come to you, Fatima, with this, but perhaps also Professor Ziba Kalam can talk about it. The question is whether there is a difference of opinion between Supreme Leader Khamenei's house, his Beit, and the office of the Supreme Leader, the office of the Rakhbar. Are there differences between these institutions, and how does the Raisi election play in that? Anyway, take a stab at both, and then we'll get answers from others about their views on these two very interesting questions.
So these are great questions. As you may know, that Maulavi Abdul Hamid, the leader of the Sunni, supported Raisi, and another Sunni leader mentioned that, well, we are reformists, but for 24 years we supported reformists. We haven't seen anything from the reformists. They ask us to try them for once, and we are giving a chance to them to see if something will change. Mm-hmm. I think because Raisi and basically in general his team are looking for 8 years, not only 4 years, I assume they have to give some minimal basically point. Really, it was a real shame that while Abdul Hamid Maulavi supported Rouhani, he even did not invite Abdul Hamid to his inauguration ceremony, and everybody criticized him. I believe they might, while clergy, Shia clergy has issue with Sunnis. As you may know, Sunnis, as my understanding, they don't have even a mosque in Tehran. And these are like basic things. Even it's so. I believe maybe at some middle senior level, they would give some position to Sunni, especially in Kurdistan, not governor, like deputy governor. And maybe they would allow a couple of mosques here and there. But I would not think that would be like a fundamental change in like considering them. This is one point. The second point is about the differences. Of course, there are different attitude inside the leadership, office of the supreme leader, and while the rift is wider, those people had to move, such as Natiq Nouri, who was serving in office of supreme leader, but after a while that he thought that nobody is listening to him, he decided to leave. I think those differences is minor. It's not main things. I would say Mojtaba has a higher hand in his office. And I believe that basically the whole setup is to provide a platform for Mojtaba to be next leader.
Yeah, you're not the only one. This is the
I understand. Some people,
yes,
in some people thinks Raisi will have more chance to be leader, but I think this is a real setup for Mojtaba to be a leader. As you said, I am not the only person believe this way.
Yeah, look, Iran had a revolution to get rid of the monarchy. Borzu, are we back to a monarchy in waiting here?
I mean, it's so tough to answer that question. But I also have talked to people who are, saying if you look at Raisi's career trajectory, if you look at where he comes from, basically a 19-year-old kid brought on to do the regime's dirty work. Basically, the guy who's willing to get his hands bloody. And go from town to town and ordering the execution of dissidents, even while they're serving their prison sentences. Not that they're not. They've already been tried. This is a guy who calls himself a jurist, but is abrogating sentences by other judges in extrajudicial killings. So I think he's basically someone who is a loyalist. Someone described him in a pretty decent piece in Foreign Policy as more of an opportunist than an ideologue. But as we know in the United States, right-wing opportunists are just as dangerous, if not more, than right-wing ideologues. So, after the experience that we just had. So I don't think that's any better necessarily if he's an opportunist or an ideologue. But yes, I mean, he'll do what the Supreme Leader says because he spent 15 years at his feet at his weekly talks. And so he's perhaps a placeholder more than a presumed heir.
Could be. I know we don't have too much more time with Professor Ziba Kalam, so I want to go back to you there are a number of questions about sort of what happens next. And I know you said you didn't really know, but I mean, we do have a lot of figures, yourself included, who are very respected in Iran, who've been part of the reformist movement, who continue to criticize the government. What do you see? I mean, people have tried a variety of different means. So how can Iranians best express their opposition and do it in a way that will not simply call on more repression? I mean, we already have so many good people sitting in prison, so many courageous lawyers. I'm thinking particularly of Nasrin Sotoudeh and many others. What are the avenues for expressing views in a way that is relatively safe, I guess? Or is it ever?
Barbara, there is a Persian proverb. You might have something in English as well. I don't know. But there is a Persian proverb which says that coming out of a shallow well, just to be thrown into a deep well. Sometime in our life, the decisions that we take is like this: we coming out of a not so much deep well, only to go into a deep which is
in English we say out of the frying pan and into the fire. This is the expression in English. It's the same thing. Yeah,
exactly. And in my opinion, of course, there are many Iranians, particularly in expatriate Iranian living in the United States and in Europe, who strongly disagree with me over this issue. But I believe that the overthrow of Islamic regime, even if we succeed to overthrow the Islamic regime, to do something like the Islamic Revolution 2 years ago, is coming out of the frying pan to go into the fire. Because, in my opinion, there would be such a chaos.
Yeah.
There would be such an internal struggle amongst the courts, amongst Sunni, amongst the more religious Iranian, amongst the less religious Iranian, amongst the more affluent Iranian, the less affluent Iranian, and the whole country would collapse. I keep mentioning that, well, look, Syria is an example that can happen to many other countries, but because many Iranian are racist, I'm afraid, just like the white American who are racist. There are many Iranian who are racist, and they are very much hurt that you tell them that your country actually might happen into the same scenario that Syria was in. They say, no, we are Persian, we are Aryans, we are Iranians, we are not Arab, and it's the Arab. They even when they dance, there is a sword in their hand. No, we are peaceful generation, etc., etc. And I keep telling that look, our civilization, Iranian civilization, the Syrian civilization is maybe more historical and more deep rooted than Iranian civilization. Why do you think that the Syrian were not were just shallow people and they had no civilization, they had no history? Why do you think that what happened in Syria would not happen in Iran? Because Iranian people are so good, they are so intelligent, and they are from Aryan race, etc., etc.
Yeah, Professor Zibakhan, I have to tell you, I got into a lot of trouble on Twitter recently when I noted that many Iranians had expressed anti-Arab racist views to me when I have been in Iran. And I got all kinds of, oh, no, we support the Palestinians and all of this stuff, and was quite heated. But I wanted to ask, if I could, Fatima, tell us about your organization. I mean, the diaspora Iranians are constantly trying to do something to help their fellow Iranians inside the country. What can they do? What are you trying to do? Is there anything more we can do except put a spotlight on the abuses of the government?
Yes, well, one real concern, as the name of the organization suggests, Nonviolent Initiative for Democracy, this is my real concern as we go more and more. And unfortunately, even we see this violence, not only inside the country, but by the regime, and even we see sort of violence by the opposition, and it's very sad and heartbreaking to see this. Look at to this election, what happened. I was pro-vote in this election. And my point, not only me, I was a target of violent, verbal violent. But other people, and I would have said to them, hey, look, you guys say freedom, respect of human rights, democracy. What type of democracy is that I have to get under attack? I have to receive violence because I advocate for vote and you say no vote. I respect your view. Are you respecting my view to vote in this election? And we've seen some footage about physical violence. And unfortunately, some of our great colleague, intellectual, even I feel they sort of normalize violence. They separate physical violence from other type of violence, this is against the very definition of violence in everywhere. Violence is widespread. As we consider like psychological torture, as we call it white torture, those are means no physical violence, but still violence. So, and I see like when I go to Clubhouse, I see language of violence. I understand there has to be justice, but my main question always is, where is the balance between justice and a peaceful transition? How we could stop cycle of violence? This is a main concern that I believe everyone has to have. Dr. Ziba Kalam mentioned greatly, there is no differences between us as an Iranian and the Syrian. If we come to the conflict, we may tear each other apart. And this is a real concern. What we do in this organization, we haven't started addressing the violence itself, but mostly we empower civil society activists with peaceful means. And I think this is very important. One lesson that we learn from all this so-called Arab Spring revolution is once there is a gap of power, those who may come get to fill this gap that it's not good for this society. And if we have a trained civil society that they have skills, maybe that would help to reduce sort of violence.
Yeah, well,
and I think it's very important to address nowadays how we want to deal with violence and non-violence transition.
Yeah, that's a wonderful goal. And I would hope that all of those who are active on social media treat people with different views on these topics with a little bit more respect and than they often do. And I think it's particularly true of the way women are treated. It's for people who claim to be supporters of women's rights, to see the kinds of attacks that they direct against women who support engagement with Iran, it's really disheartening. And a reminder, diplomacy is always important, and it's perhaps even more important with countries that are adversaries and that are extremely difficult to deal with, like Iran. I have one question on the nuclear issue, and I'll let Professor Ziba Kalam say briefly his thoughts on this and then go to the others. There's a question about whether Iran is, going to build nuclear weapons. I have my view on this. I think that it's not going to happen because every time they get a little bit ahead of the game, there's a mysterious explosion at Natanz or a scientist is killed, and we know that the Israelis are keeping a very close eye and they haven't changed their policy. But Professor Ziba Kalam, do you think Iran is really going to ever try to get nuclear weapons to go the North Korea route, or is it still possible to keep that from happening?
Barbara, there are some Iranians, not necessarily hardliners. I have some colleague at Tehran University who believe that they are calling me. This is my last.
All right, your last comment, and then we'll let you go.
Yeah. Who believe that Iran must have a nuclear device as a safety, because otherwise Iran can be invaded. They say that if, for example, the Taliban had a nuclear weapon, if Saddam Hussein had a nuclear weapon, they would have been spared from being invaded by the United States. So they believe that we must have a nuclear weapon. But I think that the majority of Iranian leadership are wise enough and shrewd enough not to accept this argument. Barbara, I must say goodbye to you, and my
thank you so much.
Unfortunately, has started.
Thank you so much, and be well. Stay safe. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you much. Okay. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
All right, we're going to continue. We still have another half an hour, and so we're going to continue with our esteemed panelists. Azadeh, what do you think? Will Iran ever go for nukes?
I mean, as you said, Barbara, the question is, do they have the capability to do so? I mean, can they have, if they were to do it, obviously, you would have to have a clandestine program. And can they have a program clandestine enough that it wouldn't, come up? If we have a nuclear agreement in place, which is one of the main reasons we wanted to have a nuclear agreement to begin with, is that we have very wide, intrusive inspections and verification mechanisms in place. So the most important thing at this point, I think, is to reestablish those mechanisms and make sure that the IAEA has the necessary access. When it comes to other clandestine, activities, as you mentioned, what we've seen so far has been a quite even surprising ability by potentially the Israeli intelligence and security establishment to obviously be able to get the nuclear archive out of the country, be able to have targeted killings of nuclear scientists on Iranian soil, able to have acts of sabotage on nuclear facilities. So there are actors who will not be standing idly by and not be waiting for the nuclear agreement or the other talks to move on. So it might not be that likely. In the end, Iran doesn't really need nuclear weapons. I mean, if you have the capability and can have demonstrated that you have a short-term ability to get to weapons, that already increases your deterrence capabilities by a lot. And that in itself is worth a lot. So I don't think they might necessarily want to go, have that dash for the bomb. But again, I think having a more credible short-term capability in itself is quite valuable.
That question, by the way, came from the great Professor Ervand Abrahamian. So thank you for that, Professor, and thank you for watching this. Borzu, same question to you. Will Iran ever get a nuke, or is Israel too good at what it does? and frankly, has it become too valuable as a bargaining chip? I think you're muted, Borzu.
No, not anymore.
Okay.
So I first of all, I just wanted to say, and I didn't want to waste time when Dr. Ziba Kalam was here, but I'm just so honored to be on this panel with Fatemeh Haqiqatjou, who was this very prominent member of the Iranian parliament in the sort of reformist era. And I don't know if she remembers when I was like a little freelancer in Tehran, I came to the University of Tehran, and I think I interviewed her once. And Dr. Ziba Kalam, who's been like a longtime source, and Azadeh, I've tried to interview her, but she's always too busy.
Maybe now she won't be.
I'm very, very honored to be on this panel. No, I mean, I essentially agree 100% with Azadeh. I don't think that I don't think their aim is to get a nuclear weapon. But yes, as Dr. Ziba Kalam said, there are voices in Iran, and they're getting louder and louder, saying we need to get a nuclear weapon. We need to get a nuclear. And you know what? There are people in Pakistan, people in the wider Muslim world, and people in the developing world who are cheering it on, and those voices are being heard in Tehran, saying that, like, look, these people in Brazil are saying Iran should have a nuclear weapon. And that is resonating among a certain group of people in Iran. and not necessarily hardliners, rather pragmatic people, hardcore Iranian nationalists of the kind that Dr. Ziba Kalam was describing so eloquently, who are kind of like, we have to get it before the other people in the region get it, i.e. the Arabs and so on. And so I think that there is a danger that voice will eventually become more prominent. Will Israel be able to sabotage it no matter what? Who knows? That's a question for the services to answer.
Fatima, do you have a view on this? Do you think Iran will ever get a nuclear weapon?
Well, I would say that the pursuit of nuclear program was for the nuclear bomb. But as this has been discovered 2003, I think the strategy has been changed because they understood that it's so costly and they can't do it. And usually the life of the regime, Hifz Nizam, protecting the regime itself is the main key important issue for them. So if that would cost them Hifz Nizam, so they wouldn't pursue that. As simple as that. So I wouldn't see in a near future they would pursue that. I wouldn't see, when I say near future, I mean at least for next 10 years, I would not see anything toward that side.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. And I'm just today, there are reports that the Bushehr nuclear reactor, which is Iran's only functioning civilian nuclear power plant, has had to be shut down for some mysterious reason. So, I think people are getting the message. We're going to turn to the region and also to the China-Russia question just a little bit more in our remaining time. We have a question, this is directed to you, Azadeh, about the ties with China and so on. Are we really we're going to see Iran finally join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? It's been an observer for some time. And here I think they need the sanctions relief in order to actually participate in this organization. What do you think?
Yes, I mean, first of all, that's an important point that you mentioned, Barbara, the sanctions. In fact, part of the problem of the sanctions regime for Iran was also that it was obstructing Iran's look to the East policy. So Iranians going for lifting sanctions is not just about having better, let's say, trade relations with the Western world, which might not really fully materialize the way that they're hoping, but they also need that in order to be able to conduct, more substantial business with their Eastern partners. And we saw that during maximum pressure, actually, that even Chinese state-owned Chinese companies have difficulties investing in Iran and keeping up their investment in infrastructure projects. So that's a major issue, and one of the reasons also why I believe that hardliners also and even YC should have an interest in having sanctions suspended and fully reinstating the nuclear agreement. And yes, it is an obstacle to the full membership in the SCO, though I would have to say that the obstacle was basically created by Russia and China back then. I mean, I don't think it was in the statutes that they can't do it, but maybe it was. But we've seen more kind of resistance by Beijing rather than by other actors when it came to full membership here. And that is because I think, China and Iran have quite different ideas of what the SCO should stand for and which direction it would take. If you look at the Iranian perspective, Iran in many ways is quite self-dependent when it comes to creating its own security. It's not a member of any kind of security arrangement. It doesn't get any kind of security guarantees as a lot of Gulf states do receive, for instance, from the United States. It has an interest in joining, in further regionalizing itself and joining kind of regional groups that might turn into a little bit more of a defense structure. This is not necessarily where China wants to take the SCO. So there are some differences here, and it's not necessarily clear whether Iran would really fully benefit from being a full member, because then you will get between the lines between, let's say, Russia and China and possibly other actors as well. But yeah, this is certainly something that Iran is going for. As for its look to the East policy, I think it's important to note that this is not specific to hardliners or to YC or any in that regard. We actually see that Iran is moving towards the East either way. I mean, it makes sense economically, it makes sense from an energy perspective, it makes sense to see the future of the global gravity of power when it comes to energy and trade in Asia. And it also makes sense from a geopolitical point of view. Obviously, there are more similarities when it comes to ideas of political and global order, multipolarity, and the kind of role that Iran is going to play in the Belt and Road Initiative, in different kind of Indian-Russian infrastructure projects. Obviously, these provide Iran with a very specific, powerful position in terms of order that Iran doesn't hold in a Western-dominated global order system. So I think in many ways, it makes sense for Iran to turn more towards the East. How far it will go and how far it can go depends on a number of factors. And surely, I think the way that the Western community is going to deal with Iran will impact that as well.
Yeah, thanks. Boris, let me ask about Afghanistan. And I believe there was a meeting in Antalya recently, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan. The United States is withdrawing. Our troops will be out. And as I think you pointed out, others have pointed out, Iran is very good in terms of putting, how did you put it? Lots of chits, lots of bets on the roulette wheel. I always say Iran is very good at riding multiple horses. So they have their relationship with the Afghan government. They have their relationship with the Taliban. They're close to Turkey, which has volunteered to take over the defense of the airport. Curious if you could talk about how you think that plays out as the U.S. withdraws. And then talk about Iran-Saudi. Where do you see that going?
Well, I think that the Iranians have an interest in a stable Afghanistan in which the Taliban does not rout the government of Ashraf Ghani, just because they don't want millions of more refugees coming into the country and putting stress on the system. And I think Turkey is really, which is where the most of the refugees want to end up after going to Iran via Pakistan, very dangerous route that they take. Turkey also wants to block these migration. And so there's an interest there in, if the Taliban is going to take control of Afghanistan, it has to be in a sort of orderly process with a kind of consensus within the political elite there, so you don't have all these people, flooding towards Europe and putting stress there. I saw this in Iraq during my many years there. One of the most extraordinary things about Iran in Iraq is how it sort of buys people in every single political faction. They don't care if you're Sunni, Shia, Kurd, they'll do that. They'll buy operatives, they'll infiltrate and so on. And they do it through local actors, and they do it quite effectively. But the drawback is for Iran, they might get that sort of clandestine relationship that Iran builds with its neighbors through the IRGC, through the Vezarat, through the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, and through the Quds Force. That doesn't translate into many benefits for the Iranian people. Like a more transparent relationship with Iraq, for example, or even a future Afghanistan, would be a more healthy relationship for both countries, where there would be normal trade and stuff like that. But the way they do things, everything under the table, everything's secret, every irregular border crossings, and this sort of cloak and dagger way that they operate with their near abroad. It may feel good, it may seem like they're in control and give them the illusion that they have control, but in the end, it doesn't really yield much. It doesn't yield much in terms of creating export markets, creating genuine normal trust, and doesn't help the growth of institutions that build trade between these countries and build normal commercial and economic ties.
Yeah. About Saudi Arabia, we've had some talks in Iraq between Iran and Saudi Arabia, some suggestion that maybe they'll exchange ambassadors, reopen embassies. Mohammed bin Salman has certainly had his comeuppances on a number of fronts. Things are not going swimmingly for him. How do you see that going?
if you remember, the really bad blood between Saudi and Iran came as a result of hardliners storming Iranian Saudi missions in Iran to embarrass Rouhani. So, I think that, now that there's no Rouhani to kick around, that there'll be less of an incentive for the hardliners to, now that they're the ones who have to be the adults, so to speak. Look, the bottom line is Saudi Arabia is a big, important country, and it's right in the neighborhood. And, they have a lot of weapons, they have a lot of economic power and so on. So you can't ignore it. And, ostracizing it hasn't helped. Having bad relations has not led to anything good between Saudi and Iran. The coronavirus pandemic is ending. People are pining to go to Hajj. So perhaps it's a good moment for good relations to come back.
Yeah. Fatima, what do you think? Do you think that we'll see some sort of patching up of Iran-Saudi relations?
Well, I think things would improve, but remember, Saudi and Iran are regional power. They are rival. They want to have more portion of the region. So I think this tension in itself would still create more issue. But I guess when Salman realized that he didn't have upper hand in Yemen and other issue, and basically even sanctioning one of the Persian Gulf country, Qatar, didn't really help. So I think he's coming to a realization that, well, they have to work together. But I guess I wouldn't imagine the condition would be as best as the situation that we had during Hashemi Rafsanjani, because of his unique relationship with the king, King Abdullah. And remember, one more point, that although it seems that the regime consolidated power, but because of the corruption, the systematic corruption inside the country, still those who benefit from the corruption may create issue for Raisi. Otherwise, he has to pay them and have them to control them. So I wouldn't see, even though, yes, Corona is going away, the situation going better, I wouldn't see a smooth situation in the country. One thing that we have to remember, that I believe at the level of political, social sphere of the country, the atmosphere even would be closed more and securitized. But they would try to improve economic condition, but they think to sort of, they model still is distribution model rather than development as a main issue. I think the main point here, because still the regime direction is not development, comprehensive development, this would create tension. Even the Raisi that seems very loyal, as his wife say, the big thing about Raisi is he's very loyal to the leader. I think that there is tension between the office of the president and the supreme leader. And this tension, maybe not at the year 1 or 2, but somehow we'll see this tension. Remember, now Raisi is thinking him as a going up the ladder, and there is like a rival in the office of the supreme leader, Mujtaba. So also this would create another tension. We should remember that Rouhani had aspiration to become the next leader as well. And I guess one other aspect that why they really put him in the corner is to make sure he's not liable candidate for the office of Supreme Leader. This would happen for Raisi as well. But one thing that I would like to pay attention, he talked about taxation, and the Supreme Leader talks about a resistance economy. Resistance economy, maybe they are trying to think to other sources such as taxation. He was the head of the wealthiest organization, Astane Quds. Astane Quds and other organization that is under the Supreme Leader office, they don't pay tax. And there is other, like the tax system is not good in the country. I think myself, I would give credit to him if he reforms the taxation policy in the country, and that might be something out of his office as well. We should wait and see if he would take that direction of taxation into account.
Interesting. You know, even Saudi Arabia now has increased taxes. They have very large value-added taxes on almost everything in order to deal with their budget deficits. I think a lot is going to depend on the cabinet that comes in, whether these people are proficient or not. I remembered under Ahmadinejad that, like the president, many of the cabinet ministers were completely incompetent in the fields to which they were nominally appointed, and a great deal of money was stolen, a great deal of money was wasted at a time when oil was $100 a barrel. So I'll be interested to see whether the competence level improves. We have a piece coming out on our Iran Source blog today or tomorrow on some of the people who may fill cabinet positions for Raisi. So that will be interesting to see. Also, thank you, Fatima. You answered one of the questions. One of the questions was about whether the next Supreme Leader could be a reformist. And you strongly implied no, because I do agree. I think Hassan Rouhani had the best shot at that, given his background. And it doesn't look as though he's going to be making a comeback. I would imagine he's going to go somewhere and write his memoirs, as will probably Javad Zarif write his memoirs yet again, since they will not be employed by this administration. Yeah.
Yes. One point that I would like to add, maybe it would be interesting for the audience. I believe it's less likely Saeed Jalili become foreign minister of Raisi administration because basically the policy is not to create tension. I think the Supreme Leader, his military ally, and those conservative learn lesson from Ahmadinejad presidency as well, that tension create problem for the country. So even they understood that well, even because Larijani was supporting emphasizing more on East rather than West, meaning China, other Asian country, and plus Russia. They understood that even dealing with South Korea, China, Russia, they have to solve their problem with the West. Otherwise, they can. I think these are lessons learned from the whole last 16 years. That is why I believe it's less likely one person such as Saeed Jalili become the foreign minister. Maybe the former foreign minister, I forget his name, during Borzou, you may know.
There's a deputy foreign minister.
During Ahmadinejad.
I think he's on our list. Yeah, he's more professional. He's more of a technocrat. Yeah. And perhaps a hardline technocrat rather than Jalili, who drove people crazy during the Iran talks, as I'm sure everyone remembers, with his long speeches about everything horrible that had been done to him by the United States and the West. Yeah.
He would have been the best option, but I don't see Salehi become head of the like foreign affairs minister.
He did it once. I mean, he came in the second part of Ahmadinejad, and he did a reasonably good job. Yeah.
Yes, that is why I say he wouldn't be the next foreign minister. And I think the head of judiciary, I saw in media that they say Mohseni Ejei. I would less likely imagine Mohseni Ejei at the head of the judiciary. I think Arafi might be a person who like take over the judiciary rather than Mohseni Ejei.
I think Ejei was the spokesperson for, was it the judiciary?
Mohseni Ejei is
the national security. I remember meeting him in the mid-2000s in Iran. He was quite a character.
Well, Mohseni Ejei is one of the most qualified because he served, in terms of his experience in the judiciary. Of course, I am not in favor of him, but I believe he has less chance to be, hopefully, I hope I become correct. I think Arafi has a better chance to become the judiciary head.
All right, listen, folks, we're coming toward the end now, so I want to give our last two speakers a chance to sort of sum up who will be in the cabinet, and then also this persistent question about how Iranians will register their discontent. Professor Zibakalam didn't want to really get into that, I think, but are we going to expect sort of civil disobedience, Gandhi-esque sorts of things, petitions, funny videos, memes on social media? Where do you think it's going to go now that this election is over? So Azadeh, first to you, and then Borzu will let you be the cleanup hitter.
Yes, I mean, on cabinet picks, that's not of much significance to me at this point. We will know soon enough. But I think more importantly, the question on what can be done, because I think obviously we've seen particularly part of the middle class not being too inclined to have the kind of regime change maybe some people are hoping for outside of the country. There are actually enough people who are worried about Iran turning into the next Syria or the next Libya. So if we take those who are a little bit more reserved when it comes to this kind of more violent, let's say, overthrow, and also decided not to take part in the elections, the question remains, what is actually left? What's the middle ground? What's the avenue that you can take if you want to go for some kind of meaningful change? And obviously, I don't have an answer for that. I think that's the answer that has to be given by the Iranian people in the upcoming years. What I do think is that the kind of creative forms of protests that we have seen will definitely continue. The demand for social change will continue. We are likely to see protests and dissatisfaction. We are also likely to see, particularly when it comes to women, the type of what has been regarded non-movements of women, meaning that you take day-to-day action that is just going to happen. The way that you wear the hijab, the way that you take off the hijab already is something where you create a space for yourself, which makes it much more difficult for the state to respond. So I think if you look at women in Iran, you already see a very effective, in many ways, kind of movement that has been, regarded non-movement from a conceptual point of view. I think these types of movements are going to continue. I do believe, however, if in any kind of autocratic system, if you want some kind of sustainable change outside of revolutions, at some point, you will need to have some kind of cooperation or working together between streets and people in power. And here I think a lot of burden is also on the reformists. They cannot stay the way they are. I think they've rendered themselves totally insignificant. If they want to play a role, they need to have a completely new outreach to the general public. And the second thing that will be needed is actually cross-class solidarity. That's something that was effective during the Arab Spring. We haven't really seen that in Iran. We've seen the 2009 movement being essentially a movement of the middle class. We've seen later protests in the past years being mainly dominated by low-income households. You need some sort of cross-solidarity, cross-ethnic, cross-class, cross social line solidarity if you want to have sustainable, more meaningful change. And this includes not shaming people if they want to vote, not shaming people for the type of political action that they feel is necessary or important to take. I think otherwise we are only introducing more toxicity into an already difficult environment. We are only adding to the pressure that's already existent. So I hope that at least we from the outside are not, are able to refrain from adding more obstacles to what's already existing on the ground in Iran.
Thank you very much. Borzi, last word goes to you. And just one reflection, I watched some of the debates, and I know it's like Robin Givhan, who writes for the Washington Post, who was a fashion critic and then has become a political critic. You can tell a lot by what people wear. And all of the candidates, except for Raisi, who had his clerical garb on, were wearing Western shirts, open at the neck, no tie, but none of these high-collared, strangulation shirts that the apparatchiks of the Islamic Republic wore for 20, 30 years in public. Changes happened, and the society has moved on. Women wear what they like pretty much most places. They may not go and stand on a utility pole and wave their scarf in the air, but they wear what they want. People live the best they can under the circumstances. So how do you see this going forward? Just a greater separation of society and state, and we leave the government to you people, just don't get in our face. How is it going to go?
Well, I think that the Iranians are in a sort of crossroads at a dead end, really. They've tried for 25 years bringing about some kind of meaningful change through peaceful means, through elections, through voting, through non-voting, through some sorts of civil disobedience, through a peaceful protest, silent protest sometimes. And it has brought about nothing. I think that the sort of shallow, kind of superficial changes that are taking place in society are taking place, but none of it has any meaning because the Islamic Republic of Iran is still a political monopoly run by Shia Islamists. There are no liberals, there are no leftists, there are no nationalists, there's no secularists, there's no parties that represent religious or ethnic minorities like other, even failed hybrid democracies have. And that is a problem. And that system will get brittle. And I'm afraid that at some point, given the, confluence of autocratic politics and disastrous climactic change, the scenario that Dr. Ziba Kalam described, the one that I described once for a piece that I wrote for you guys, of this collapse of Iran and the toughest warlord taking over. I think that is becoming more and more less like a sci-fi scenario and more a possibility for the Islamic Republic.
Well, that's a pretty depressing note on which to end. I still have faith in the Iranian people somehow to find their way through this mess, and it's not because of some racist views of Persians versus Arabs. It's just the experiences I've had in the country over the years. So all I can say is our expectations for Raisi are rock bottom, and there is nowhere to go but up, I would think, at least in terms of his performance. I want to thank my speakers so much. You guys were fantastic. All of you, particularly wonderful to see you, Fatima, again after so long. And I will invite you to come and join us at the Atlantic Council again. And folks out there, we hope you will follow our Iran Source blog and see all the wonderful things that people are writing for us. We will continue our analysis. So thank you again for joining us, and be well, everyone.